to eMentor's webinar series with your host, Ann Tropea, Program Manager at eMentor. This is a recording of our live webinar. After you've finished watching, please head over to our website, www.ementorprogram.org, to see the lineup for future webinars and to learn more about the eMentor program. And now let's get started.
My name is Ann Tropea. I am the program manager for eMentor. I have with me Joe Tropea, who, yes, is my husband and also a filmmaker. I'm so lucky. And his filmmaking partner for Hit and Stay, Skiz Cizik, who is also a prolific filmmaker separately as well. I'm just going to let our panelists give you a little bit of an introduction themselves. And if each of you can just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what brought you to filmmaking in the first place. That would be great.
Age before beauty, Skiz.
Let's see. I started making films in the early 80s, around 83, I guess. And I came at it as a film buff. As a kid, I borrowed a movie projector from my grandmother, and I found out that you could sign out 8mm and Super 8 film reels from the public library. So I got fascinated by not just the films themselves, but the actual mechanical, this strip of plastic on this reel goes through this machine and makes this moving image up on the screen. I was fascinated by that. And I was also a musician and a storyteller, and it just seemed like filmmaking was a way to incorporate a lot of things that I love into one process. And so I started taking film classes at Towson University. It was Towson State University then. That was in 1984. And kind of gravitated towards underground film, guerrilla DIY filmmaking, and never really got out of it. Even when I tried, I never really got out of it. I'm still making very low budget DIY productions. And so, yeah, I've made a whole bunch of short films and music videos and a handful of documentary features now. That's pretty much it.
I came to it similar as Skiz, a film buff, but I would also have to partially blame him. I was in a band in the early 90s, and my band was going to go on tour, and we needed a drummer. And we got this fill-in guy who learned all of our songs in a really short amount of time, and that was Skiz. And on the way home from the tour, we didn't kill each other, we didn't hate each other, and he kind of invited me to move into this group house that he lived in. That was an old funeral home that was filled with musicians and filmmakers and other assorted freaks. And I was invited to join in, and just living there, I would get pulled into people's projects, either as a extra, like actor, or one time Skiz made me play kazoo in one of his films. And so I got interested in filmmaking from not only being a fan of movies, but from getting to see it happen around me where I lived. And then I got a job at a video store, which Skiz also happened to work at, but not at the same time. Skiz had left. And I spent 10 years working there, and that was kind of my film school. I went to, I studied history in college, and consider myself a public historian. And I see documentary filmmaking as very much an extension of public history, telling stories, telling true stories. And I currently I'm a working public historian. I make a lot of exhibition videos these days, and other various videos. And I've made 2 features and a short or 2 and a bunch of a music video here and there. And I've helped on a bunch of Skiz's projects. So that's my story.
So both of you are located in Baltimore, correct?
Yes.
I'm located just downstairs from Tropea.
So I think this is a good segue to where, we're talking about history, we're talking about film. How did Hit and Stay kind of come into creation? What was the genesis of that film, and how did you both decide that you were going to jump into this project together?
I'll start it off. I was in a history class in grad school. It was the history of Vietnam, the Vietnam War specifically, and we had to write an essay as like the culminating thing for the class. And I knew of this protest action called the Catonsville Nine, and I thought it would be more interesting to cover an aspect of the Vietnam War that wasn't necessarily combat or even on foreign soil. I was interested in grassroots movements and specifically the peace movement. And I was aware that there were people in Baltimore that I could access who might do interviews with me. And in history, we call them oral history interviews. But I told Skiz that I was going to do this, and I'll let him chime in on what happened next.
Yeah, when Joe told me this, I said, how are you going to interview them? And he had a digital audio recorder. And I said, man, take a video recorder, like shoot these interviews on video. Even if you don't use the video, just the fact that these interviews will exist on video, that footage will become really important to some documentary filmmaker down the road. Because these people are getting, up there, they're not going to be around forever. And that led to Joe roping me into going to all the interviews with my video camera. And so after we'd shot several interviews, Joe kind of said, hey, I think I want to be the filmmaker that uses this footage for a documentary. So all of a sudden, Joe is now making a documentary and I'm shooting it. And he kept asking me if I wanted to partner with him, but I was already busy with some other projects. I'm like, nah, I don't have time to be making another film. And then I realized, but I'm putting more time into Joe's film than I'm putting into mine. So I might as well be a partner. So we partnered, and the direction of the film, I mean, when we started, it seemed like it was very Catonsville Nine centric, which, Lynn Sachs had already made Investigation of a Flame. So it didn't really seem like we needed to be remaking that film or making the feature length version of that film. But luckily, while we were doing these interviews, we started hearing these other stories about these other actions. And it suddenly seemed like, oh, hey, here's something that hasn't really been covered that much yet. And so we had an angle for a documentary film that we had not yet seen.
Yeah, I was very interested in the idea that, first, that priests and nuns were breaking into draft boards and kind of luring young people in to join them. And it occurred to me, like, these, some people call them the numbers people, because it's the Baltimore 4, the Catonsville 9, the Camden 28. By the time I heard about the Camden 28, it occurred to me, 4 people, 9 people probably didn't do this on their own. They probably had a lot of help. And I became very interested in, like, people who what would help in committing, like, federal and state crimes like this. And that's when, that was what I really had access to, that we had access to here in Baltimore, is a lot of the people that helped the Catonsville Nine. And as we interviewed people, we kept hearing, oh, you should talk to this person. They did something in Philadelphia, or they did something in New Jersey, or Boston. And, I don't really think we had an end in mind when we started. We kind of were open to letting the story go where it took us. And that went against everything every professor I had in grad school told me that no, you have to know your ending. And I said, well, how could I know my ending? I'm not there yet. Like, I'm not done the research. How could that be? So I resisted them mostly, or I just started to pretend like, okay, yes, sure. I know the ending. But yeah, it just, we kind of went on a journey, which explains why it took us like 7 years to make this film, which we should say is not necessarily recommended. It's not really how, the names that you've heard of, Gibney, Poitras, Moore, Earl Morris, I don't think it's necessarily how they do it. They, Ken Burns, they kind of churn them out a little faster than 7 years at a pop. But that's how it went.
And the credits to their films are a lot longer than ours. There's a lot more people in their credits. Yeah,
Getting
7
paid.
years. One of the funny things that happened during those 7 years is that filmmaking changed from mini DV tapes to HD cards, memory cards. And we were kind of in the middle of it. So by the time we finished our film, the industry standard in filmmaking was a lot more high res than what we had been shooting. And I took my savings and had bought a whole new video camera package that by the time we were done this film, I couldn't use it for any work. Forgot about that part.
Which is why I've always resisted buying my own camera. Yeah.
So for everyone who is joining us, I have to assume the majority are not filmmakers and maybe just are really interested in film. Maybe they're, very interested in the process of just making a documentary and how you go about that. And I think for me, what's interesting is that, Joe, like you decided kind of, at the last second, hey, I'm going to make this documentary, had never done it before. Like you, of course, seen documentaries and seen films, but what made you think that you could just jump into that world and start this intense, well, you didn't know it was going to be 7 years in the making, but it seems like you probably knew there were going to be challenges along the way. What prompted you to just take that leap and start this project?
I think the honest answer to that question is I lived around filmmakers, and I've worked on other people's films like semi-professionally on a few occasions. So I guess that gave me a kind of confidence. But also it really, to me, it was like, well, this is just like researching a topic in history, keeping track of all your citations and sources. So it really felt the same to me. Instead of just typing words into a computer, it was putting images on a screen, but there was plenty of typing words into a computer while doing it. So I think the maybe false illusion that it wasn't really that different from other types of historical creation.
And what about you, Skez? I know that Hit and Stay was not your first film, but what gave you the chutzpah to say, I'm gonna be a filmmaker?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, my very first film I made because there was a talent show and I wanted to do something in this talent show and I didn't know what to do. I had an idea, but it wasn't something I could actually do there on the spot. I'm like, oh, but if I made a movie and showed the movie, and that's what got me started. And then the film classes, and I talk to a lot of filmmakers. I give presentations and stuff, and I always give this advice that anybody can be a filmmaker. Like, so, if you have one of these, you're most of the way there. Like this thing, the film that I made my senior year of college, actually, it took me 2 years and it took all my money. It took thousands of dollars. I could now make it in a weekend on this without spending a cent. And, these are amazing tools. And then add that to a laptop, you have everything you need to make a movie. Just go out and make it. No one is telling you you can't do this. You might have a hard time getting it seen when it's done, but worry about that then. Just go out and make something, get it made. It's fun. It's a creative outlet. I love the whole process. I mean, my day job, I'm a video producer for a company that publishes newsletters, and I make these infomercials trying to convince people to subscribe to the newsletters. I make videos that are tedious. I can't even watch them, but I actually enjoy making them, because it's a fun process of, I have this element, I have that element. How can I put them together? What's the best way to make them work? And I always say, my favorite part of filmmaking is it's problem solving. Like, you have to figure out, what do you want to see on the screen, and then how can you get that on the screen? And that's, pretty much what my day job is. That's pretty much what all my films are. I've made a whole bunch of animated films, and, those are amazing to make because you're pretty much working one frame at a time. And when you watch them, you're the only person that sees every single one of those frames, all 24 frames per second, because you worked on every single one of those frames. And you had to, because that's how you got what was in your head up on the screen. So yeah, it's inspiring, and the payoff is wonderful when you finally finish a film and you watch it. And even after that, when you show it to an audience and they like it, and it's an audience full of people that you don't know, that's like the best.
And I think too, the fact that we're both musicians, there's something to just, we on some level, we want to be on stage, we want to be watched, we want people to see our output. So
that definitely makes sense. And I think it's encouraging to hear that, anyone could pick up their iPhone or their smartphone and just start shooting footage and, telling a story that they want to tell. Let's kind of move into some of the nitty gritty about making Hit and Stay. You guys gave a good overview of kind of what that encompassed in terms of the narrative. But how did you, I guess an initial question might be, how did you identify the people that you wanted to talk to? And then how did you go about, kind of like very logistics, like how did you reach out to them? Did you call them? Was email a thing at that time? Give us some insight into the beginning of that process.
So our subjects tended to be people who were of age in 1967, 68, 69, and the 70s. So they were aged by the time we're starting to make this film in the late 2000s. So we did use email, but I also wrote a lot of letters because that's how older folks are more likely to correspond, at least back then. And one of the challenging things was, sometimes we'd interview someone and they would suggest you should talk to this person, and this person. And here I've got my phone book, and here's their phone numbers. But sometimes it was just a name, and it became challenging because, like, for instance, women often change their names by getting married. So you can be looking for a name that doesn't exist anymore at least in the public record that you're going to find in Google. So I had a friend who worked for a law office who was very good at finding people through, I forget what he called it, reverse address search but anyway, he found a lot of people for us, and I wrote a lot of letters and wrote some emails and some phone calls, and it really just played out over the course of probably 5 years of the 7 while we were making it, still looking for subjects to talk to.
And Skiz, were you involved in that part of the process at all, or were you primarily kind of, video?
Yeah, I kind of was focused on the production end, and Joe was focused on the content. And I would help if I could, but there really wasn't much that I could do there. I do remember the one guy we were trying to find who we never found. Was it Boyd?
Boyd Douglas, the informant.
Yeah, I remember we were asking everybody we knew, like,
And my my finder friend, Richard is his name. Ultimately, I think he found him living under the name Douglas Boyd, which is just so clever. He was if you watch the film, he's the one that kind of turned witness against Phil Berrigan, and got some of the letters between Phil and Liz, who he would go on to marry, while they were in prison. And we at that point in making the film, Boyd Douglas was a character in the film, but it didn't. I mean, we talked about it, right, Skiz? We talked about like going up to his door and knocking to see, what he might say. But it occurred to us, like, he lived such a interesting life of someone in and out of jail. Like, what would he say that wouldn't just take the film in a weird direction that we might not be prepared to go in?
Yeah.
And really the focus wasn't on him. It was kind of, on the aftermath of what he did and what other people did. So we just left that one go. But I did have a great experience writing a letter to William Lynch, who was a federal prosecutor. And I asked him to be in the film, and I've saved his letter. I meant to try to dig it out, but he wrote back very indignantly that he would not have anything to do with a project that would glorify the Berrigan brothers, least of all the outlaw Bill Ayers of the Weather Underground. So I mean, it was like the angriest letter I've ever been written, and it was very brief and to the point. It was kind of great.
I liked the one interview. We showed up to interview the one FBI agent, and he mentioned another FBI agent who was like lived across the street or something. Like somehow we ended up with two of them. And
that was our twofer.
Weren't we looking for the guy, the other guy?
Yeah, we were looking for a bunch of FBI agents, and we found one, and we arrived, and he had the other one with him. Like it's like I've never heard of this before, but he like surprised us with an extra subject to interview, and then they drove us all around the Harrisburg Penitentiary, kind of gave us the tour of Harrisburg, and then bought us pizza and like fed us. It was pretty great.
Well, I wanted to pause for just a moment and let everyone here know that if you do have a question for the filmmakers, kind of as we're going through this conversation, feel free to just put it in the chat or put it in the Q&A, and we'll if we can pause while we're talking, then we'll address questions as they come in, but otherwise we can just wait until the end. So feel free to do that. So I think, it sounds like you kind of identified a bunch of people that you knew you wanted to talk to and started the process of reaching out and getting them to agree to be on camera. What else, other than like the interviews and the oral histories, like what else went into telling this story? How else did you decide to piece that together?
Archival footage.
Yeah, a lot of searching for archival footage, and often getting lucky. I think we found, not everyone did what the Catonsville Nine did, which was invite a news camera crew to cover them while they committed their act. But we were able, like in Providence, Rhode Island, we found footage that a local station had shot of their draft board after a raid happened, and there's papers. It looked exactly like what you would think a raid on a draft board would look like. We had a lot of luck with local TV stations here, and a lot of great images from newspapers. all around the country that covered actions in their localities. So yeah, a lot of archival search went into it. And sometimes people had their own personal films that they lent us. And another big component was music, I'd say, because we thought long and hard about, what kind of music do we want in this? And we didn't really, well, we knew we didn't have any money, so we weren't going to be licensing the songs of the time period that you would expect to hear. So we just kind of turned to our friends and found a lot of great stuff. One of the main, I think it's the outro music. It was our friend Sina, who was a local musician going under the name Bean. I saw her performing at a venue, and she played the song that's in the film. And as she was playing it, it hit me like, this sounds like the story of the action community, which is another name for the draft board raid people. And I approached her. I didn't know her well. I approached her, and she said, "Well, I've never recorded any of these songs." And I talked to Skiz about it, and he said, "Well, let's invite her to my basement studio and record her songs." So I don't know how many songs we did with her.
2 or 3, because we use another one of her songs elsewhere in the film. And I thought there was a third song we started that maybe never got finished.
Yeah. But it was a cool experience because she got to, record in a studio. And I think we even played on some of the tracks. And, so she got something out of it and we got something out of it. And I love her music and the way it fits with the images. And we have other friends who we approached, whose music we were more familiar with, and just asked their permission. And on the low budget level that we were at, the main way they got paid was I promised to take them out to dinner as a form of payment, and that's what happened.
I like that it was pretty late in the process where I think the film, we had our final cut, but there were still some sections that needed music. And Joe and I just got together in my basement a few nights with some instruments, and we would just watch the scenes. I'm like, all right, let's play something that would fit that. And so there's one section where it's a whole lot of bass and drums, just kind of doing this jazzy jam. And that's just the two of us looking at the video and playing. And then there's like a marching snare. And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. So we made what we needed.
That's amazing. I was going to ask, considering you both are musicians, whether, whether you had thought to score the film yourself. It sounds like you didn't sign up to do the whole thing. It's probably a lot more work than you were wanting to do.
I had a friend who I learned a lesson from years ago. She was working on a film, and she had some friends who were in a band, and these friends were supposed to give her a piece of music for her film. And by the time she needed it, they had kind of taken off. So when she contacted them, they were like, yeah, can you ask our management, which they didn't have management when she first asked them. So management was like, yes, you can have this song. Here's how much it will cost you. And she's like, I don't have any budget for this, so I can't pay for this. So I can't use the song. And it was like the night before she was supposed to go into a post house and have her film mixed. So she sat down with a 4-track and a Casio, and she just made some music and she put it in her film. But then she registered it with like BMI or ASCAP, which, I guess a smart thing to do. Well, the film premiered at some big festival. It got picked up by public television. It showed all over the country. And she told me that for years, she never made a dime off the film, but she got royalty checks for that piece of music. And some of those checks were really large. And that made me think, okay, every film I make, put a piece of my music in there just in case. Hasn't really paid off for me yet, but one of these days.
And I've subsequently started paying for music in the other and stuff I've made after Hit and Stay, and it can add up.
Yeah,
as it should. It's it's someone's work. So
yeah,
I want to kind of go back to both of you talked about how archival footage and photographs and materials were really important for this film about a historical moment in the US. How, for people who are not historians by education or trade, are these types of records available to kind of regular folks? If I go to a library, would I have access to those same types of materials?
The newspaper clippings, yes, but news footage, probably not.
yeah, I tell people all the time that the thing I love most about my Enoch Pratt free library card, other than 10 films a month on Canopy, is access to ProQuest, which searches all the major newspapers, the black newspapers from in the early 20th century. And it's just an incredible resource. You can learn, you can spend many hours doing ProQuest research just on newspapers. But it really, I work in a museum and archive, and it's so I have an insider's view of how people approach us, but it's really about learning who has what and who to ask the right question. Because, not every archive will even have film and video. Some have tons of it. Sometimes free libraries have great film collections. The one in Baltimore, the Enoch Pratt, has an amazing celluloid film collection that much of which you can check out like a book. So yeah, you never know who's holding on to what, and you just have to keep asking questions, and it can take a while for your question to hit the right ears.
Yeah, that's great. I think, for documentaries, that's probably more, historical documentaries, that's going to be more important, maybe not for other types of documentaries, but talking a little bit more about the process of Hit and Stay. We've talked a little bit about kind of your approach to finding the story and finding the people and the materials. Skiz, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about the actual process of filming all of these great conversations. What are some things that maybe a beginning filmmaker might want to know or might need to know? I know you said you could film it on your iPhone, but maybe that's not the best option. If you're trying to put something on the big screen, you tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the iPhones have definitely come a long way in the last few years, but if you can get more professional gear, by all means. And you don't have to buy it. There are rental houses. There are places where you can rent it for a day or two or a week. And I'm always a little surprised that it's not nearly as expensive as I would expect. Advice I always give the filmmakers, and this comes from I've been a film festival programmer for decades now, and I've seen a lot of documentaries made by filmmakers, low budget filmmakers like myself. And one thing that I've learned from their film, I always try to learn from other people's mistakes. And one is, if you're shooting a documentary, 3 things you should always bring: your tripod, a light, and a clip-on lavalier microphone or a boom mic that's just over their heads out of the shot. Those 3 things will automatically make your interview so much more watchable. And a lot of people don't think about that, especially the microphone. You're in a room with the person you're talking to, you hear them fine. but what you're hearing isn't necessarily what the microphone on your camera is using. So you want to get a microphone as close to their mouth as possible. And that's where the clip-on lav mic comes, or the boom mic hanging over top of them. The light, same thing. I mean, auto exposure on cameras is great, but you're making that camera work a little harder than it should have to. Just add a little more light to the subject. And then also figuring out how to frame your subject. I mean, I think for Hit and Stay, I framed most of our interviews so that like they were over here, kind of looking this way, and that way we had all this space. If we needed to put up, we put their names in that space. And we usually had a second camera that we could cut to also in case they said a lot of ums and uhs, and we didn't want that taking up our screen time. So we could cut to the other camera to make it flow a little better. So yeah, those are like the best things to keep in mind when shooting an interview. At work, I deal with this all the time. We're shooting an interview and someone will worry about the sound of a car driving by in the background. I'm like, it's an interview, it's reality. There's cars, we don't have control over that. But that's one thing to take into account when you're arranging an interview, is where you're going to do it and what like I've heard a million horror stories from people shooting outdoors and the next door neighbor decides to mow their lawn, and then you ask them to stop and they ask for money, so you have to be prepared for these things. Maybe have a plan B.
Skiz, I'm remembering when we filmed Sister Joanne Malone. She lived in a very particular part of DC. Like, I don't remember what it's called, but it's right on the water. And we thought or maybe it's me, I thought the water's going to make a great backdrop.
Yeah.
And, what we learned was that it doesn't make a great backdrop. Same with Gren Whitman. We filmed him on a pier. And what water does is often there's a lot of wind because it somehow they go together, water and wind. So Gren's interview was almost ruined by excessive wind. I mean, you can see his hair's blowing like crazy. And I know Skiz spent a lot of time trying to deal with that. But with Joanne Malone, it was a beautiful backdrop, and it was still water, but water echoes. And then boats started coming through, and it wasn't just a little bit of boat, the boat echoed through, it was like a canyon. And it really almost ruined that interview. So yeah, think it through and think about what could go wrong with your idyllic backdrop setting.
What was it? It was Bill Ayers that the interview started in a meeting room, but then he had to get to the airport. So the rest of the interview was in the backseat of the car driving them to the airport. Yeah.
And his head is just doing this the whole time because we're in a car. But that was I like to say that's the verite part of Hit and Stay. So.
It's problem solving. Like I said, filmmaking is problem solving.
So
we were just happy that he would continue the interview in the back of a car. There were still questions left. And sorry.
Noam Chomsky, that interview where we had 20 minutes of his time or something.
We were in a line of other productions too. There were at least 2 other film productions waiting for Noam Chomsky. And I guess we were first in line. And his assistant let us know, you have 20 minutes with Professor Chomsky and not 1 minute more. And I asked the first question and he spent 12 minutes answering it. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm sweating bullets, terrified to cut off Noam Chomsky. But then you just realize with 8 minutes left, I got to cut off Noam Chomsky and shut him up.
These are the glamorous realities of filmmaking, right? Have you tell a famous person to stop talking? I was hoping you could clarify. You used the term verite, and I I think we all know what that means, but if you could explain to everyone else listening in, that would be great.
Skiz, you went to film school.
Oh, I'm not sure how you actually define it. I guess it's just sort of handheld, fly on the wall camera work, which is my latest
Run and
documentary.
gun.
Yeah, my latest documentary is all that. Actually, there's a guy, Lee Gardner, who used to be the editor of the Baltimore City paper. Just as we were finishing Hit and Stay, I think we had just finished it, and I was working on another documentary that I'd been actually working on the whole time I was working on Hit and Stay. And he had a social media post where he complained about documentary filmmakers and how much they rely on talking head interviews and archival footage. And I was like, well, how else are you going to make a documentary? And I'm like, and come on, man, I just finished this one and I'm working on this one, and they're both, that's all they are. And that got me thinking, like, well, how could I make a documentary without doing that? So my latest documentary, Sound Mechanic, like, I made a bunch of rules to follow, and one of them was no talking head interviews and no archival materials, and it was completely verite. I think the term they use is observational documentary, where the camera is just observing. You're a fly on the wall, you're watching what's happening, and then you take all that footage and you edit it into something hopefully watchable.
And when you make a documentary like that, at the very beginning, you guys talked about how, film professors say, well, you have to know where your story is going. You have to know where it ends. But with verite filmmaking, the point is that you don't know where it's going to go, right? You don't know where it ends. Maybe you just make an arbitrary decision, like, okay, I'm done now. Let's see, this is my story, and you get to decide because you're the filmmaker and you're in charge. Or do you let your subject decide? I mean, how do you make that determination?
I mean, it was easier with Hit and Stay because there was this narrative that we followed, and it came to this kind of good conclusion, we thought. With Sound Mechanic, and one of my other rules was I wasn't going to tell a story unless one unfolded while I was shooting. And one did unfold. COVID happened, and my subject picked up and left the country. So I was like, well, there's my ending. And that's my story. Is this guy was doing all this stuff, and then COVID came and it kind of screwed up everything he was doing. So he left. He went to another country where COVID hadn't shut everything down yet. So yeah, I guess I got lucky in both films.
And what about you, Joe? I mean, how do you feel about that type of filmmaking in general? Have you ever thought about doing something similar to what Skiz has done with his latest film?
Yeah, I've thought about it. And I just want to clarify one thing. To be fair, history professors told me I had to know my ending before, I finished. Yeah, I would love to one day do something like Sound Mechanic that is, improvisational in every aspect, I think, because the guy's kind of an improvisational musician. But what I haven't figured out is how to a story that lends itself to that, and the funding to because say I found a story that I thought I could do that way, but if it took like 2 years, 3 years to make, I need a day job. So that's always been my worry. So I tend to stick to historical stories where I have a fair chance of figuring out what the whole thing is at some point, and know the beginning and the ending within a reasonable amount of time, if you can call 7 years a reasonable amount of time. But yeah, I would love to do that one day.
We haven't really talked about the funding yet, and I've mentioned it a few times that I'm a low budget filmmaker. Like, I will do things as cheap as possible just because where's the money coming from? Otherwise, I have a lot of friends who are, I hate to say professional filmmakers in comparison to us, but it is their day job. They get jobs with Netflix or HBO, and they get budgets basically to make these films. And that kind of seems like a dream, To me, I'd love to do that, but a lot of times the subject matter that I choose isn't something that those companies would have much interest in. And so going back to my anybody can be a filmmaker, again, if you got one, you don't need any money, you just pick it up and start shooting and start editing it. It is nice to get some money, and especially if you call in some favors to pay the people that are working for you. I mean, we've always been lucky. We have a lot of friends that are just like, yeah, I'd love to be involved in that, and they don't expect money, but it is always nice to pay them since they are working. We did a Kickstarter and got some grants. But for the film we made, what we actually spent, it wasn't anywhere near what it should have been. Like, somebody else making the same film as a professional would have spent probably 10, 20 times more what we spent making this film.
Yeah. And also I think people at that level figure out how to pay themselves. And, we did not. I think we figured out the amount of hours that you spent editing Hit and Stay, you made like less than $2 an hour.
And I did get paid. I was getting a small paycheck, so I didn't have to go out. This was before I had my current day job. I was freelancing, and so I did get from the money that we had raised, I got a small paycheck so that I didn't have to go out and keep looking for freelance work. But yeah, it was I was editing like 14 hours a day, and the paycheck definitely helped. But if you worked it out hourly, it was less than $2 an hour.
Yeah, I'm shocked at how gratifying it is to be able to pay people. Like, so for my day job, or when I work for museums, I tend to have a budget, and like sometimes it can be fun, like a weekend in the Hamptons, or I can afford to hire like a really specialized great camera person, or even just a good camera, a great camera person who just holds a camera and does a great job. It's I'm shocked at how gratifying it is to be able to pay people. I mean, part of that could be that it's other people's money that I'm putting in their hand, but it just feels good to not have to beg favors anymore. And my second feature, which Skiz also produced and helped a lot with, I paid more money for the outro music than I will ever make on, and it wasn't a lot, but I spent more money just on one song because that like one song had to be the thing to end the movie on. And I feel pretty good that the musician who, recorded and wrote that song, got some money out of it. So, but yeah, Hit and Stay was a Kickstarter, right? We did a Kickstarter. Yeah. We Kickstarter I guess we were doing it in 2010-ish when we were raising the money. Yeah. Kickstarter wasn't as played out. We hadn't asked our friends a half dozen times to give us money for our latest project at that point in time. So we kind of got lucky and raised a good amount through Kickstarter, and we got some small grants and a lot of donations. As I mentioned, like a lot of our subjects were older people, and I knew like sending them a Kickstarter link in an email, and say, hey, help us, chip in to make this film about you, just wasn't going to work. So that again was like a letter campaign or like an ask. So some peace studies programs gave us some money, but not because we asked them. It's kind of because a subject coordinated and recommended our project to the particular school and particular program and got us some money. And yeah, a lot of really nice people helped us out in that way. But but it's not easy, and it's not always fun. Kickstarter, I've never enjoyed crowdfunding. It's not a pleasant experience, and I don't look forward to doing it in the future.
I like, when you're able to pay a camera person and a light person and a sound person, the fact that they're getting paid means they're going to do a good job because they want more jobs. But the amount of stress that it takes off your shoulders, because like I said, I will do all of those things myself, but that's a lot to stay on top of. So when you got multiple people and that's their specialty and they're doing it, and you're just like, wow, some shoots I'm like, oh, what am I here for? Like, I don't have anything to do, besides yell action, and cut. But yeah, it takes a lot of stress off. And then, you get the stuff back and you realize, I'm so glad I hired that guy because he's like so much better than I am working that camera.
So, I mean, now that you both have kind of made a bunch of films together and separately, what are some things you wish that maybe you wish you would have known before making your first film? Like what should people be thinking about? Maybe some of the people here today are saying, I love movies, I want to make a film. Well, I don't know where to start. Like, where's a good place to start? Do I write a pitch? Do I learn how to use editing software? Do I raise money? I mean, it just seems like, do you do all of those things a little bit at a time all at once? What are some of your kind of, from your experience? I mean, I'm sure there are best practices out there, but let's forget about that. What do you guys know? What would you recommend?
I say just start, just do it. I mean, your first film may not be great. And if it isn't, don't show it to anybody, make it again, or move on to the next one and learn from your mistakes. And then work your way up to bigger projects. And keep in mind that, like, my least favorite part of filmmaking is figuring out what to do with the film when it's done. So keep that in mind. There's film festivals tend to be the outlet for films like ours. Learn about the film festival circuit. There's advice that people always give that, keep your premiere in mind. And by that, they mean you want to premiere it at a big prestigious festival like Sundance or Slamdance or South by Southwest or Tribeca or Cannes or Toronto. And, that's kind of terrible advice because it's not up to the filmmaker. You say, all right, I'm going to premiere this at Sundance. That's not your decision. That's Sundance's decision. So if
it's like you should win the lottery advice.
And so if you don't get into Sundance, well, that's January. Well, maybe you'll get into South by Southwest in March. Well, if you don't get into that, well, maybe you'll get into Tribeca in April. Well, if you don't get into that, maybe Cannes in June, and so on. And eventually a whole year has gone by where you've been sitting on your film and you haven't premiered it. So I say, go ahead and submit to those festivals. The odds are against you, but there's still odds. If you get in, great. Distributors will see your film. Other festivals will see your film and invite it to come screen at their festivals without you having to pay to submit to those festivals. But in the meantime, just go show it wherever you can. Like, I always recommend small regional fests. Like, you get lost in the shuffle at like a Sundance, but at a small regional fest, you're like a big fish in a small pond and you have a blast, and, people see your film and they love it and they love talking to you, so, just keep in mind what you're going to do with your project when it's finished.
Yeah. Just start. That's great advice. I think, just do it, right? Like, you don't have to show people if you think it sucks. Go to film festivals, see what they're about, talk to other filmmakers. They'll have a lot to tell you. Doing film fests is a journey. You will learn to embrace. You'll learn to figure out how to deal with rejection, because you get a lot of rejection letters, and that's just life, right? And I would advise like setting your limits before you start, because you can spend way more money than you intended to by submitting your film to festivals. 25 to $75 a pop will add up after a very short time. But film festivals are way more fun than any other conference that you might have to go to for another type of job. So I highly recommend it. And yeah.
And are film festivals things that, normal non-filmmakers can just attend? Can I just get tickets?
We
Anybody
hope so.
can go. I mean, they're public events. Anybody can go. And one of the great things is, you get to meet the filmmakers. Like, they usually show the film and then they have the filmmaker come up after the film and answer questions. And then after that, the filmmaker's hanging out. Go up and talk to them. Film festivals are a great place to make new friends who are other filmmakers who might know more than you do, or might have better connections than you do. And I hate that term networking, because I kind of feel like friendship should be honest. Like, when networking just sort of feels phony, but I get the concept. You meet somebody, you maybe get them involved in your project, and then they bring what they have to the table, and your project's better off for it.
That's great advice. I've been lucky enough to go to a few festivals with Joe now, and they're super fun for sure. Would recommend to anyone who's listening in or attending here today. I wanted to kind of bookend our conversation about Hit and Stay and just ask you guys, are there any like behind the scenes, like fun stories, anecdotes about either filming it or editing, the post-production work, kind of, or any challenges that were just like totally unexpected, where you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to solve this problem? I have this problem. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, well, I can think of one. Sometimes you will go to interview people and they seem like great people, or better yet, they seem like amazing characters. Some people get shy in front of a camera. Other people light up and but sometimes our memories aren't so great. So without naming any names, we interviewed someone who gave us an amazing interview. I mean, sang for us, did really cool stuff that just excited us as we were interviewing them. But then, we transcribed all of our interviews so that we could read them and remember them and see which parts. And we realized several things we were told were just misremembered. And that's how the human mind works. I can't remember what I did last week, so I'm not judging anyone. But that was that was tough. That was all this great footage, and a lot of it we couldn't use because it got certain facts wrong.
I do remember, we took a lot of trips, a lot, and most of them were just Joe and I, and with whatever gear we could carry. We took the bus up to New York to interview Ramsey Lewis. So, we're on a Bolt bus with whatever gear the two of us could carry. And then we're navigating New York City, subways and taxis with all this gear. We went all over, that was pretty fun.
Well, it's been really interesting to kind of get some insight into the filmmaking process overall, and definitely learning about how you guys went about making Hit and Stay. And I know a lot of the people here have watched the film. And again, if anyone has any questions for either of the filmmakers, please feel free to put that question in the chat and I'll read it. But I thought it might be nice if both of you want to talk a little bit about kind of what you've done since Hit and Stay. You've mentioned it kind of here and there, but what you've been working on since that film, and what you're working on now.
Well, I was during the 7 years that we were working on Hit and Stay, I was also working on a film called Ice Pick to the Moon that ended up taking 20 years. Uh, and that was a documentary about an obscure musician from Alabama who, again, I didn't have an ending, but over the course of the 20 years, an ending showed up, which was that, this obscure musician who had not performed in public since the late 70s decided to perform in public. So that was my ending. And then when I was finished the film, I got word that, he went into the recording studio and recorded a new album. So there's two endings to the film. And so I finished that up, and then I started working on Sound Mechanic, which is a documentary about Neil Feather, who's an artist who invents new musical instruments, and then he does improvisational music performances. And I've just done a bunch of music videos. I have a doc short that I'm hoping to edit. I'm hoping to start editing any day now. There was a concert film called Erga Music War that was very important to me back in the early 80s, and it's still important to me. And I came to realize that it seems to be rather obscure, even to a lot of people that I would expect would know about it. So I wanted to make a documentary about its importance. And that's another one. I've been shooting it for 20 years. I can go 5 years without shooting anything for it, but when the pandemic started, I thought, I'm going to sit down and finally edit this. And I didn't, but that's sort of like the next project on my plate. I hope that I'll actually finally sit down and work on that.
And Skiz, if anyone listening wanted to kind of find your work or watch some of the other films that you've made, where would they go to do that?
I have a really awful looking website. It's skiz.net, skizz.net. And I basically use it to keep track of everything I do in case I forget something I've done. But, anybody can go look at it. I have a filmography page on there where I list everything that I've done for myself. I don't list my for hire things or my day job stuff. And then I include links if something is available to watch online or to stream somewhere. I include links.
Awesome.
I think before I give you my spiel, I see we got a question which is about for those who might want to pursue formal education for filmmaking, are there any certification programs or shortcuts to obtaining a full-blown degree? There really aren't many video stores out there anymore, so that's not an option. And I don't know of any certification programs, although there are local resources for people. There's a good one in the Silver Spring area called Docs in Progress, which is for, documentary filmmakers just starting out. They're worth checking out, Docs in Progress. I'll also just say that, I know plenty of people who went to state schools that are working filmmakers. Skiz went to Towson. I know other people who went to Towson and are filmmakers. And I have a bunch of friends that went to University of Maryland. So there are lots of ways to approach, and there probably are local programs in your area that you could check out. Again, and I would think they would sometimes even sponsor film festivals. So that's another good reason to check out a film festival and go and meet people and ask questions.
Yeah, there are a lot of film schools. Depending on where you are, or if you want to relocate, Full Sail down in, I think it's in Orlando. I always hear great things about that. And that's sort of a quick track filmmaking course. Here in Baltimore, I went to Towson. Towson's film program now is a lot better than it was in the 80s and 90s when I was there. They now have working professionals teaching the classes and helping their students actually get jobs on film sets to get experience like that. That didn't happen when I was there. I think they had a couple internships to work on Crybaby or He Said, She Said, and that was pretty much it. But like I know teachers at Towson that somehow they're able to fit in teaching classes and working on, House of Cards or whatever is shooting in the area, and they pull their students onto the crew, which, wow, I would have loved that. And then, there's the famous ones, there's UCLA's film school and Tisch up in New York City. Not exactly fast track, you got to put a couple years in there, but if you got a couple years and you want to relocate, they're fine. But yeah, Full Sail, I think is if you want a quick education, which again, you don't need it. There's probably ways, sign up for lynda.com. There's probably a lot of courses on there. I learned After Effects from there. That didn't exist when I was in school. But now I won't say I'm a master, but at my day job, I'm the guy everybody comes to with questions. I'm like, hey, I just learned all this stuff taking this course, sitting at my desk during work hours. Didn't cost that much.
Yeah, lynda.com is great.
And just to remind everyone, Joe, you do not have a degree in film. You didn't study film in school.
I do not. I have a master's in historical studies.
So the next question was, are there any programs that you guys know of that are specifically targeted to military members or veterans, or are there ways to kind of leverage that service to the U.S. To kind of get that education or get extra help or funding or all of the above?
I actually don't know. I'm not sure. I would say there probably are, but I don't know specifically.
I will say that I know that there are grants available for veteran filmmakers. So that's something if you're, at least in terms of funding, that's something all of you could explore. There are lots of lists out there. If you just do a simple Google search for, beginning filmmaker grants, and then grants specifically for different kind of sections of filmmakers, women, veterans, first-time filmmakers, et cetera. So there's a grant for everything out there. The trick is finding them and then figuring out how to write that grant. And that's not a skill everyone wants or needs. But Joe, will you tell us a little bit about kind of what you've done since Hit and Stay and what you're working on now?
Sure. After Hit and Stay, I did another historical documentary about the history of film censorship in the United States. It's called Sickies Making Films. I got interested in it because I learned that my state, Maryland, had the longest running censor board in the country. We had a 3-member board that viewed every film that showed in a theater all the way until 1981, and survived a lot of people trying to shut it down and kill it. So that's kind of a historical tragicomedy of sorts. My last short was a little rock doc about a band and their barber. Is called Fugazi's Barber. And just to keep this as updated as possible, I have Premiere Pro open on my computer now because I'm working on an exhibition video for my day job, and it is it's an exhibition on the civil rights movement, and we're calling it an oral history mixtape, and it is it's on my desktop right now, waiting for me to get back to it.
And Joe, where would folks go to see your other films or your shorts, or is that even possible if it's still playing?
Yeah, I never got my act together like Skiz did and get his own website. I always made websites for each film. So Hit and Stay had a website. Sickies Making Films has a website. I don't make them for short films, but but I'm on all the social media platforms I can stand: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, my name. Yeah, so I need to do a website that is my name, and I'm gonna get on that very soon.
Definitely. I'm sure everyone would love to kind of follow along with both of you and see what amazing things you're doing next. Well, I just want to take a minute to thank both of you for your generous donation of time to eMentor, and everyone who is here live with us, and to everyone who might be watching the recording later once it goes up on our website. So thank you both on behalf of eMentor. And any parting words, any last minute advice you absolutely need to let everyone know about?
It looks like we got another question here. Let's see. My question is, were there any political complications encountered that tried stopping your production or distribution of this film? And I don't think there were. I do remember we did a news story when we were doing the Kickstarter, and the comments on the TV station's post, there were death threats against us from people that weren't too happy with the Catonsville 9 still to this day. But otherwise, I don't really remember anything getting in the way of us.
No political implications that I know of. I'm assuming we probably have files with the FBI. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's a little self-aggrandizing. But distribution is a whole other problem that we didn't talk about, and that really could take its own hour discussion to talk about. But yeah, distribution is tricky. And you don't always get what you think you're getting. But yeah, otherwise, no political implications for us. I think the greatest form of payment for Hit and Stay is hearing from people on, both sides of the political aisle that they feel like it's a pretty fair film. We did everything we could to interview people opposed to what the Catonsville 9 did. And we lucked out with some FBI agents and, giving their opinions. So that to me, was like a form of payment.
That's great. Well, I'm glad no one was harmed in the making of this film.
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we'll go ahead and end. Again, thank you both so much for donating this time to us. And we'll be looking for you on the big screen.
Thanks. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for watching. If you would like to be the first to know about upcoming events, or if you're interested in receiving individual mentoring support or offering your mentoring expertise, please consider joining the eMentor program. Find out more by visiting our website at www.ementorprogram.org or send an email to admin@ementorprogram.org. Finally, feel free to follow along with eMentor on social media. We hope to see you next time.